Sure, I'd be glad to. So this is a case that is a pretty new one. So, we wanted to let you know we do have what's called the religious prisoner of conscience cases that we adopt. We've not put him in the system. He just was arrested just at the end of last year. I think it was November. And so I wanted to let you know a little bit real quick about our religious prisoners of conscience. This is outside. You can grab one. They're people that we advocate for publicly. We work with their families. We get permission, and that are just some really extraordinary people that are suffering for their faith, or for the fact that they don't have the faith that the government wants them to have. And so it gives us the opportunity to advocate for them. We do have a lot of work we do behind the scenes. There's one case I can think of recently that is just touches me so much, but a lot of what we do is behind the scenes. So these are the public ones that we do, because we really do believe everyone has this right. In Rami's case, he's been a great advocate just for Coptic Christians to have the right to be able to practice their faith and to be able to just have the lack of marginalization, I think, that they deal with a lot in this society. And he was arrested in November, I think 20th, just days before he was on to go to a UN event on minority rights. And we understand he was beaten and tortured, and he was charged with joining and financing a terrorist group. This is a Coptic Christian, so it's really disappointing that he's been through this, and he's currently in trial detention, I understand. It's been extended, and I know that Amnesty's done a lot of work on this, so we've kind of been having you guys brief us on what's going on. I'd love to have you weigh in on this one, too.
Sure. Yes. Okay. So for this particular case, Egypt is, in terms of human rights, is in pretty bad shape, and it has been for quite some time. I think the current government of Egypt, led by President Sisi, has led really a vicious crackdown against civil society activists, against protesters who are out protesting anything from economic conditions to a lack of political participation, to individual religious minorities, in particular the Coptic Christians. You have a situation with Egypt where things weren't that much better under the previous government before President Sisi came in, and the government before that. So you have successive waves of crackdowns that have sort of decimated civil society in the country. And Rami's case is sort of emblematic of the broader trend moving in the wrong direction across the entire region. And that's been a trend that's been steadily worsening over the years, and I've seen an acceleration of that within the last 5 to 6 years. In particular, in Egypt, you have Rami, who was I believe, protesting or taking part in some demonstrations, and he was an activist, so to speak, not necessarily calling for anything dramatic or any sort of violent overthrow of a government or anything like that, but he was swept up in this broad crackdown that does not discriminate. And I like to say, if you are a autocratic ruler in the Middle East, you generally do not discriminate when it comes to cracking down on people who are speaking out against you. So it doesn't really matter if you are a Coptic Christian or another religion in any of these countries. If you're saying bad things about the government, if you're out there protesting, you get on their bad side and you could end up in prison. To conclude as to just how bad it is in Egypt right now, we at Amnesty refer to it as the largest open-air prison for critics in the world. There are 40,000 people, at least, that we know of, 40,000 people that are languishing in Egyptian jails and prisons at this moment. That is a huge number. Did that number blossom the last year or two? No. But has it been rising exponentially the last several years? Yes. And those are known figures. I fear what the real number is. We don't have access. We don't have access as a human rights organization to Egypt. We're not allowed in. So I worry about what will happen to him. We just had an American citizen die in an Egyptian prison. I worry about what happens to people like Marsha, which we'll talk about later, who are sitting in these justice systems that are deeply flawed in the Middle East and North Africa that often lead to bad scenarios. And I'll leave it there.
I want to just follow up with that and discuss a little bit about, you mentioned 40,000 people. That's an enormous number. And there's no real numbers beyond that you're aware of. In other words, there's no way to be exactly sure how many people there are, 40,000, but globally around the world, is there a figure you can give our audience?
Ooh, I'm scared to even.
Yeah, I think we've tried to, we're afraid to guess, but far too many. If you were to look at countries, obviously like North Korea, and put all the countries in that arrests, focusing probably on minority faiths.
Yes, yes.
It would be heartbreaking.
Okay, so Peter, I was hoping you could discuss with us a little bit more about some of the cases that you have been working on that you can share with us that have had success stories.
Absolutely. I think the biggest success story, and this is one that we partnered with Amnesty and was really, the charge was led by USERF, was the story of Pastor Andrew Brunson, who ended up in prison in Turkey unjustly. It was the sort of trials against him were absurd. They were bringing sort of witnesses out of the woodwork that were making up conspiracy theories about when he had his lights on to claim that he was a dissident and was working to overthrow the Turkish government. It was beyond belief. What we ended up doing and working with Amnesty actually was trying to engage Congress. And we had both senators and members of Congress on the House side who became very engaged with the issue. We had senators actually travel to, Senator Tillis traveled to Turkey to visit with Pastor Brunson there. And then you also had commissioners from the USERF Commission who were over there during the trials, who actually ended up, when Turkey finally did release him, they were actually the ones who ended up bringing him back to the U.S., bringing Pastor Brunson back. So very engaged. But all of that energy, I think really the interesting thing about that is that all that energy created a level of interest here in D.C. That you eventually saw the administration taking interest in saying, this is a case of injustice, this is a case of a U.S. Citizen being imprisoned in Turkey. This is not something we're going to stand for. And you had sanctions being used that put economic pressure on Turkey. And you in pretty short order, saw a response where they released him. They sort of, they acquitted him in sort of this weird way. But anyway, they basically released him. And I think maybe the lesson there for IDC was that we should have a higher standard for our allies in the Middle East than we do for our enemies. We put a lot of sanctions on our enemies. We should have a higher standard for our Gulf allies, for Egypt, our ally, for Turkey, people who we give a huge amount of foreign aid to, people who we have military partnerships with. There's an idea that if you're an ally of the U.S., you sometimes get a pass on human rights. That should not be the attitude. The attitude should be, if you're an ally of the U.S., we're going to hold you to a higher standard on human rights. So.
I was just going to say that, to add on to that was really why they created the U.S. Commission. So when we look at religious freedom, we look at it with blinders on. So we're laser focused only on religious freedom. We don't consider a bilateral relationship. So we don't consider the security arrangement we have with Saudi Arabia or with Egypt when we're making recommendations, where the State Department has all of that to balance. So what we're used a lot of times, the State Department, when you see us going after the State Department on some sort of statement, it's usually with their recommendation, frankly. Because, with us being heavy, they can go back to their allies and say, hey, we're getting so much heat, like you've got to do da-da-da or whatever. So we're always trying to push the State Department towards being fair, because it is a tough situation when you have these relationships with these countries to prioritize. But we really do believe human rights and religious freedom should be at the top.
And then Philippe, to follow up, what are some of the most successful tools that have been implemented, whether it's in the Brunson case or others, that have been the most successful in working with members of Congress?
Well, it's a mixed bag in terms of what has been successful, what has not, as always, right?
Yep.
Peter talked a little bit about the grassroots efforts that IDC has around the country, and we have that as well. I mean, we have millions of members alone in the United States at Amnesty. And they are all tireless, passionate individuals who care about human rights. And they call up their members of Congress, and they say, this matters to me because of these reasons. And they organize in their communities, and they say, we need to talk to our neighbors, our friends, and our families about these issues because they impact me and they matter to me. So I think that's the most effective tool to make sure that you're not just in Washington, D.C., talking to members of Congress, which is very important, but you're also out around the country talking about these issues as well. You're bringing these issues home, as we like to say, because they're relevant. Both of my parents immigrated to the United States. My father's from Lebanon and my mother's from Mexico. And so, there are millions of people like them around the United States that know what it's like In some cases, they fled these issues that we're advocating for. They could have been any of the people listed here on the Prisoners of Conscience Project lists that USCIRF has, or worse. And so it resonates with these people when we go to these communities and we elevate these issues and we have them advocate on these issues in the halls of Congress. I will say that I think what Peter said really resonates deeply, I think with all of us, that we hold our allies to a different standard than we do our adversarial countries. And I think we can talk a little bit more about that. Yes. You probably have some questions oriented around that too. And I have plenty of opinions on that. But I will say that the success has been to educate members of Congress, the fact that there are actual Christians in the Middle East still, or Yazidis, and these communities that have been suffering immense levels of violence, unbelievable levels of violence just in the last couple of years, and to make sure they're talking about these issues, Democrats and Republicans. It can't just be one party over the other. And I think that we've had tremendous success at Amnesty and in all the other human rights organizations, and credit to USCIRF and credit to the emphasis that we see now with Ambassador Sam Brownback and his predecessor of elevating these issues to where they're like everyday topics now here in Washington, D.C. among the powers that be.